Would you like to come in? The words slipped out before I could stop them, softer than I intended, almost a whisper. I could feel the air between us shift, thick with something unspoken. He didn't answer immediately, his gaze lingering on me, searching, waiting. Then, ever so slowly, he stepped closer. Each inch felt deliberate, like a quiet invitation to cross an invisible line we both knew was there. I didn't move, couldn't move. It was as if the space between us had become charged, alive with an electric tension I hadn't expected. His breath brushed my cheek, warm and steady, and I felt my pulse quicken. He was giving me a choice, but I already knew there was no turning back. When his lips finally touched mine, it was gentle, like a question, a soft exploration. But then, with a quiet urgency, he pressed closer and the kiss deepened. Familiar yet new, a fire that seemed to ignite something long buried within me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, just felt. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. I'm 74, and never in all my years did I imagine I'd be telling a story like this. People often think that by the time you reach this age, you've seen it all, that surprises and mistakes are things of the past. But the truth is, loneliness has a way of creeping in, no matter how much you try to fill your days. After my husband passed away, the house grew quieter, the days longer. I used to think the garden could fill that void, but even its beauty began to fade in my eyes. I never imagined wanting anything more, not at this age. But the silence can be deafening sometimes, and a part of me longed for something, someone to make me feel alive again. They expect you to find joy in quiet moments and watch the world slowly move by. But life doesn't stop happening just because you get older. Sometimes it catches you off guard when you least expect it. It all started a few years ago, when I noticed my garden starting to wilt. I've always loved flowers. Roses, lilies, tulips. Each one felt like a little masterpiece that brought color to my life. But as the years went on, it became harder to manage. I knew I needed help. Roses that once bloomed so vividly seemed dull, their petals falling too soon. The weeds crept in, taking over corners I used to tend to with care. It felt like the garden mirrored my own life, once vibrant, now a little lost and untended. It was as if it too was waiting for something or someone to bring it back to life. That's when I hired William. William was in his late 45s, a bit rough around the edges, but when he smiled, it lit up his face. He had this unique way of caring for plants, treating them like precious treasures. His touch was gentle yet confident. He wasn't just a gardener. He was an artist who seemed to understand the soul of each flower. The first few months were strictly professional. He'd arrive early, sleeves rolled up, sweat glistening on his tanned skin, and I'd watch him from my window as he brought my neglected garden back to life. He didn't talk much unless I spoke first, which I appreciated. There was something admirable about his quiet confidence, a man whose work did the talking. One particularly hot summer afternoon, I decided to break the routine. I walked out with a pitcher of homemade lemonade and offered him a glass. "You look like you could use a break," I said, smiling. William hesitated, then nodded, accepting the glass. We sat under the shade of the old oak tree, the cold lemonade a refreshing contrast to the afternoon heat. Our conversation began with small talk. The weather, the plants, his work. But soon our chats turned into something deeper. I learned about his family, the struggles in his marriage, and how he often felt unseen and misunderstood at home. He had 2 grown kids and a relationship that had turned cold over the years. I could see the loneliness in his eyes, a loneliness I recognized in myself every time I looked in the mirror. I found myself looking forward to our talks, a little lightness in my day whenever I saw him walking down the garden path. I knew it was foolish to feel this way. After all, I was old enough to be his mother. But his presence made the house feel less empty, made me feel less invisible in a world that often seemed to have forgotten I existed. Then, one rainy afternoon, he came in drenched from the downpour. I offered him more than just lemonade. I invited him to stay for tea, to dry off and warm up. We sat by the window, listening to the rain tapping against the glass. His presence had started to feel different. He stood closer than usual, his hands brushing against mine as he reached for his tea. I noticed the way his gaze lingered, soft but searching, as though he wanted to say something but couldn't quite bring himself to. My heart raced in a way it hadn't for years, and I found myself holding my breath, waiting for something I couldn't name. That's when he said something that changed everything. He looked at me with those deep, soulful eyes and said, "You're the first person who's really listened to me in a long time." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. There was a pause, one of those moments where time seems to stretch, and everything else fades into the background. I didn't know what to say. I felt that familiar flutter of excitement, mixed with fear, the thrill of something new and the worry of what it could lead to. From that moment, things shifted between us. There was this unspoken understanding, a quiet current running just beneath the surface of our conversations. Every glance, every touch seemed to linger a little longer. I was drawn to him and he to me. Neither of us seemed willing to stop what was happening. One evening, as the sun dipped low, casting a golden glow over the garden, William stayed later than usual. He'd finished his work, but instead of packing up and leaving, he hesitated. He stood there, looking at me with a question in his eyes, one he wasn't quite brave enough to ask. "Would you like to come in?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. He didn't answer with words. He simply nodded, a slow, deliberate motion, and followed me inside. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared countless cups of tea and lemonade. But this time it was different. There was a tension in the air, a charged silence that spoke louder than words ever could. William reached across the table, taking my hand in his. His touch was gentle but firm, his fingers warm against my cool skin. I could feel my pulse quicken, the blood rushing in my ears. Neither of us said anything. We just sat there, holding hands like two teenagers who had just discovered the thrill of first love. Then he leaned in. It was slow, almost hesitant, as if he was giving me the chance to pull away. But I couldn't. His lips touched mine softly at first, then with a hunger that took my breath away. It was like he unlocked a part of me I'd kept buried for so long, a part one thought had died when my husband passed away all those years ago. We kissed, and in that moment it felt like everything and nothing all at once. Like we were breaking the rules of the universe, but creating our own little world where those rules didn't matter. In that moment, we weren't a 74-year-old woman and a married man. We were just two souls who'd found each other in the most unexpected of places. After the kiss, we sat in silence, the weight of what we'd done slowly sinking in. William looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of fear, desire, and something else I couldn't quite name. "I shouldn't have done that," he whispered. "Neither should I replied, though part of me didn't regret it at all. He stood up, his hands trembling slightly, and without another word he left. I watched him walk down the garden path, disappearing into the dusk. I wondered if that was the end of it, if we'd crossed a line we could never uncross. But it wasn't the end. Far from it. He came back the next day and the day after that. We carried on as though nothing had changed, like he was still just a gardener and I was still the old lady with a beautiful garden. But every touch, every glance felt different. There was this electricity between us, something we couldn't ignore. We didn't talk about what had happened that night. We didn't need to. It lingered in everything we said, in every moment we shared. It was our secret, binding us together, something forbidden yet so intoxicating that neither of us could let go. As the weeks turned into months, we grew bolder. He started coming inside more often, staying a little longer each time. The kisses became more frequent, the touches more daring. We were like two people caught in a whirlwind, swept up in something neither of us had anticipated. But life has a way of reminding you that secrets don't stay hidden forever. One evening, as we sat in the dimly lit living room, our hands intertwined, William looked at me with a pained expression. "My wife suspects something," he said, his voice heavy with guilt. "She's been asking questions, wondering why I've been spending so much time here." His voice cracked slightly as he spoke, his hands clenching into fists on the table. "She's been watching me closely, asking why I come home late or why I seem different lately. I can't lie to her much longer, but—" He hesitated, his eyes meeting mine with a desperation I hadn't seen before. "I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose you." I felt my heart sink. "What did you tell her?" "I told her you needed extra help in the garden," he said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "But she doesn't believe me." In that moment I knew. Our little bubble was about to burst. The world outside our garden was closing in on us. The thrill of our secret affair was starting to fade, replaced by the harsh reality of what we'd done, and what we stood to lose. I realized then that even at 74, life could still surprise you. After he left, I sat by the window, staring out at the darkening garden. The rain had stopped, leaving the petals glistening in the fading light. A part of me felt alive in a way I hadn't in years, but another part felt the weight of what we'd done. I thought about my late husband, about the promises I once made and the life we built together. Was I betraying his memory? Or was this a second chance at feeling something real? The questions circled in my mind, and I knew there were no easy answers. It could be just as unpredictable, messy, and wildly passionate as ever. But as much as I didn't want it to end, I also knew that some stories aren't meant to last forever. And maybe, just maybe, that's what makes them so unforgettable. I sat by the window, watching the sun dip low in the sky, painting the garden with a golden hue. The familiar scent of roses filled the air, but today it didn't bring me peace. My mind was heavy with the weight of the decision I had just made. I had told him it was over. William, my gardener, my temptation, the man whose touch had awakened something in me I thought had long since died. It wasn't easy, but deep down I knew it had to be done. I couldn't go on pretending that what we shared was anything but a fleeting escape. I had lived a long life, one filled with choices, some good, some not so much. But one thing I knew for sure was that family was sacred. It always had been. The love between a man and a woman, the vows they took, the children they raised. These things were not to be torn apart for a momentary indulgence, no matter how intoxicating. I thought of his wife, his children. How could I betray them? How could I betray myself? "You deserve more than this," I whispered to myself, as if convincing my own heart to let go. "I don't want to be the cause of your misery. Not anymore." I couldn't help but feel a pang of sorrow as the memory of his touch lingered on my lips. He had been gentle, tender, and oh so passionate. But in the end it was not worth the destruction. I had made my choice. But that didn't mean it didn't hurt. 4 days after, I couldn't bring myself to tend to the garden. The roses, once vibrant, now seemed to reflect my sorrow, wilting under the weight of my own regret. I knew I should go out there, try to revive the life I had once nurtured. But the thought of him, his absence, his touch, held me back. I tried to fill the silence. I busied myself with tea and books, with the quiet hum of my home. But it wasn't enough. I needed to feel something again. It wasn't just the garden that had withered, it was me. My body ached, longing for the intimacy I had shared with him. I told myself it was just the withdrawal, just the aftermath of an affair that never should have happened. But deep down I knew it was something more. My body still wanted him. And as time passed, it became clear that I wasn't ready to be a ghost, living out my days in quiet solitude. One afternoon, as I walked to the garden, lost in thought, a man's voice broke through the air. "Excuse me, ma'am. Do you need some help?" I looked up, startled, and saw a man standing at the garden gate. He was a little younger than me, maybe in his early 60s, with a kind smile and eyes that seemed to search for something deeper. He had that look, a man who had lived, who had loved, and who had suffered. There was something about him that drew me in, a calm confidence that seemed both inviting and familiar. "Who are you?" I asked, wiping a tear from my cheek without meaning to. "James," he said, tipping his hat. "I've seen you around, tending to this garden. I was wondering if you could use some help." I hesitated for a moment, but something about his presence felt right. I knew the garden needed care, and I wasn't quite ready to take it on myself. "Yes," I said finally, my voice softer than I intended. "I could use a hand." "Thank you." As he worked beside me, we spoke. At first it was small talk, the weather, the plants, the usual pleasantries. But soon, as the sun dipped lower, our conversation deepened. He shared stories of his travels, his years spent working abroad, the relationships he'd had, and the ones that had ended. His voice was smooth like honey, and each word seemed to peel away the layers of my loneliness. It was the kind of connection I hadn't expected, and certainly hadn't planned for. But with every laugh, every glance, I felt myself waking up. James was kind, and yet there was a spark in him, an energy that made me want to know more. He was different from William in many ways. He didn't carry the weight of a family with him. There was no hidden guilt in his eyes. He was free, unencumbered by the things that had once held me back. As the evening came to an end, I found myself drawn to him. His presence was magnetic, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a flutter in my chest. I didn't want to feel it, didn't want to acknowledge it, but it was there, undeniable and electric. "You have a beautiful garden," he said, his voice soft as he turned to leave. "Maybe we could do this again sometime. Could come back and help, if you'd like." His words were an invitation. Simple one. But something in the way he said it made my heart race. "I'd like that," I replied before I even realized I'd said it. From that moment on, James became a regular presence in my life. He'd come by to help in the garden, but I soon realized it wasn't just the flowers he was tending to. It was me. He'd look at me with those warm eyes, and though there was always a respect in his gaze, I felt the tension simmering just beneath the surface. It wasn't long before the touches became more lingering, the glances more meaningful. The chemistry between us was undeniable, like two forces pulling toward each other. One evening, as we worked late into the night, I reached for a tool, our hands brushing. The contact sent a shock through me, and I looked up, meeting his gaze. His eyes darkened, his breath quickening. Without a word, he closed the distance between us. His lips hovered over mine for a moment, hesitant, like he was waiting for permission. I didn't pull away. Couldn't. The kiss was soft at first, like a promise. But then it deepened, and I felt the fire of everything I'd been holding back ignite within me. It was passion, raw and unfiltered, something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in so long. His hands were on me, gentle yet insistent, and for the first time in months I felt alive. When we finally pulled away, breathless, I could see the question in his eyes. "I never meant for this to happen," I whispered, my voice shaky. "I didn't either," he replied, his voice thick with desire. "But I can't ignore what's between us." And for the first time in a long time I didn't want to. I had made my choice with William, and now I was making a new one. James. A new chapter, a new beginning. The garden was thriving again, but it wasn't just the roses that were blooming. It was me, finding the strength to live, to love again, and to embrace the passion that had once seemed so far out of reach. Family was sacred, yes, but my heart was still mine to give. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop denying what I wanted. For the first time in a long while, I was ready to let myself feel. Life is full of difficult decisions, but sometimes the hardest part is acknowledging your own desires and needs. Family is sacred, and trust is vital, but it's also important to remember that your happiness and sense of self-worth matter too. Never be afraid to take the step toward living fully, to embrace the love and connection you deserve.